As wonderful as relationships can be, between, as the Bible begins in Genesis, man and woman, husband and wife, we know that relationships can be fraught, even divisive, turn venomous, like the snake turned to Adam and Eve, and sin began to find its way creeping at our door, according to the way Genesis explains it. Two brothers, Cain and Abel, became enemies instead of friends. As powerful as chevruta and friendship and kehillah and community can be, a sad truth is that virtually everyone has some they consider rival, and worse, left unchecked. We feel hatred in our hearts. We distance ourselves from those we don't seem to get along with, or worse, come to despise. The Torah realizes that. The Torah will explain what to do with that feeling. But before we get there, let's explore this idea a little further. Because I'm sure you've noticed how many movies, TV shows, stage plays, passages in our Holy Scriptures deal with the fact that we have rivals in the world, that we define some as villains, and even enemies. Despite the balancing teachings of the Ten Commandments or Rabbi Akiva in the Talmud, who holds that the single greatest principle of Torah is ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, is to love your neighbor as yourself. We know that there's a Hobbesian worldview, that we're always in competition, always finding rivals, and worse, that we might even eat each other alive. The rabbis recognized as such in Pirkei Avot and said, pray for the peace of the ruling forces. From that we take the notion that we pray for the government. Pray because, left unchecked, people would eat each other alive. But what does that eating each other alive really look like on interpersonal levels? Not just larger societal, systemic levels. What do we do with the feelings that we have in our heart that need to be checked? And how do we advise ourselves to move beyond these feelings of rivalry, enmity, hatred, and having personal enemies? Because a lot of that has been stirring in society lately. People are enjoying, I think, too much having a villain on the other side. And the Torah wants us to reflect on that, as does our prayer book, the Tefillah, the rabbinic set of prayers that we say each day of our lives. In a bracha, in amidst those central to the Amidah, the Chatimah, the closing blessing about those who would be slanderers, says, Baruch atah Adonai, shover oyevim umachnia zedim. God who destroys enemies and humbles the arrogant. So we might ask, shouldn't we, created in God's image, be able to hope for the same pursuit in our own lives? After all, we have many traditions that say, as God does, so shall we. This is how we explain being created in God's image. God clothed the naked, we clothe the naked. God comforted mourners, therefore we comfort mourners. This is a premise in the Gemara, in the Talmud, in Sota. But this blessing in the Amida centers on God's doing ultimate justice. For we have a different kind of justice that we pursue, and that is tzedek tirdof, as we read in Parshat Shoftim in Deuteronomy. And remember it as we read Parshat Mishpatim, the Torah portion called Judgments, that is a parallel Torah portion of sorts between Mishpatim and Shoftim. The two Torah portions' names share the Hebrew root Shin Fe Tet, Shofet, judgments, justices, courts of justice, justice in our lives. How do we achieve more righteousness, more justice, more of an application of Torah law that mediates not only between us and God, but between and among fellow human beings? We focus ourselves on the blessing just before that passage in the Amida that asks for God to take care of enemies. We say that, God, you are a king who loves tzedakah umishpat. You are a king who loves the pursuit of righteousness and the application of your principles of justice, umishpat. And when we say that blessing of our Amida, right before the blessing about enemies, we stir ourselves to become more closely attached to the laws, rules, and principles of justice that are defined in our Torah. In this week's Parsha, just one of those verses is a famous one about seeing the ass of an enemy lying under its burden. The Torah in Exodus chapter 23, verse 5 says, when you see that ass lying under its burden, and it says as a regular matter of translation, the ass of your enemy, and uses the Hebrew word sona'acha, and recognizes a feeling within you, the feeling that you have that this is your enemy, and I'm not going to help him at all. I'm not going to help her at all. The Torah then commands, you must nevertheless raise that burden with him, even with the person who you feel hatred towards. Every one of us, unless there are some angels out there. I would love to meet you. Every one of us, the Torah recognizes, can feel this enmity towards another, can categorize someone as at least being a rival, if not an enemy. Uses the word sona'acha, uses the word that is more about one everyday average citizen's interpersonal relationship with another. That is when you feel hatred towards another person. You're going to immediately recoil. You're not going to want to help this person lift up the burden of that donkey. Yet the Torah commands, raise that load. Help not only that donkey for the compassion we show to animals. That's a different nature of the Torah's commandment here, one we won't explore fully, but remember, be compassionate towards this creature who is suffering, even though it is part of the family of this person you're defining as villain and enemy. Now, have we seen a little of that stirring around today? That when we've defined who our enemy really is, or who the villain is, we associate so many others along with that person that we wouldn't help them lift up a package from Fairway or Whole Foods. If we only knew who they supported, we wouldn't help them get across the street. The Torah says this is no way to live. Our hostility and our vindictive emotions may never override basic human decency. And if we help the animal of those we hold in contempt, alachat kama v'kama, even the more so, we're responsible and obligated to help those other human beings who might be associated with them, let alone members of their family. This central message of the Torah, that you should help that donkey under its burden with him, even with that person whom you've classified as enemy, leads to a midrash that sounds a hopeful note when it comes to rivals or even villains in our everyday lives. The midrash tells the story about two drivers, two who are on donkeys who hate each other. And there they were walking their asses along the road under burdens. And of course, one of the donkeys begins crouching beneath the load. Immediately, he checks himself. He feels the enmity. He feels the hatred towards this other driver, towards this other person. And he says, oh, but the Torah reminded me. When you see the ass of your enemy lying under its burden and would refrain from raising it, when your feelings are so strong that you say absolutely no, you must nevertheless raise the burden with him. Imo, ayin mem vav. That word imo, with, has the word ayin mem, has the word people in it. For Jews who feel this hatred, they must become an am. For those who you do not recognize as human, think about them as an am, as a person, as part of a people, as part of a family. And so, the second driver, who indeed would have, because of his hatred, simply ignored the donkey crouching under its burden and said, enough with that enemy of mine, came back and fulfilled the Torah precept, fulfilled the mitzvah. And as he's helping his enemy raise that load and unburdening the donkey and shifting it just right, and he said, release a bit here, no, pull a bit over there, unload it over here. The shared sense of humanity that came flowering within his heart and mind led to a different kind of association and ultimately peace between them. The driver who received the help said to himself, didn't this man hate me? Wasn't he my enemy? Didn't I see him as a villain? Didn't I see him as competition? Didn't I see him representing everything I stand against? But when the two came together to carry a load themselves, to unburden an animal, other members of each other's family, then, the Midrash says, they were oseh shalom. They were in the mode of making peace. Oseh shalom. It's an active verb. At the end of the Amidah, we take 3 steps backward humbly and bow left and right and forward, saying, God, we are in your service. We are also trying to find the strength in our hearts and souls to say, we are at the end of the day in each other's service, and hope that our senses of connectivity and humanity and human decency override our feelings of hatred, enmity, and casting others into the role of villain in our lives. This is Torah's hope for us all in every generation, in every land and society. And this way we get to a sense of tzedakah u'mishpat, of righteousness, and an application of God's deep principles of justice. Shabbat Shalom.